Welcome. My name is Jonathan Fink, and I am the Director of Creative Writing here at University of West Florida. Many people have worked hard behind the scenes to make this Visiting Writers event possible today. Thank you to Anna Locus and Brenda Gottlieb for setting up the technology for the event and organizing publicity and marketing. To the Department of English and the College of Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities at UWF for their support, to Nick and Gabe for sharing their work with us, and to all of you who are joining us virtually. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce Nick and Gabe to you, though in many ways they are in no need of introduction. Both Gabe and Nick have established literary reputations. Gabe is the author of 5 books, the most recent of which is Babel. His writing has appeared in Conjunctions, Tin House, and Post Road, among other venues, and he is the editor of the literary journal, The Rupture. Nick's short story collection, Bosses of Light and Sound, won the 2019 Spokane Prize for short fiction, and his stories have appeared in the Pushcart Prize anthology, the Idaho Review, Witness, and Tin House Online. And many of you, of course, know Nick and Gabe through Gabe's teaching of fiction writing at UWF and Nick's history as an alum of the UWF undergraduate and graduate writing programs. It's always a great pleasure to read the work of someone you know well from the classroom as a professor or student, and to see not only reflected in that work the intellect, personality, and expertise of the person you know, but also to see the ways in which the person's writing informs a more expansive understanding of them as an artist and interpreter of our shared and singular experiences. I come away from both Nick's and Gabe's work moved by the ways they use their unique experiences and talents to create distinct aesthetics devoted to maximizing the depth of inquiry into our world. In preparing for this event, I was reminded of the anecdote about Vladimir Nabokov teaching at Wellesley College. Nabokov, as many of you know, was an expert lepidopterist, which is a fancy word for butterfly collector, in addition to being a famous writer. The story goes that after one of his classes, a student approached him as he was gathering his nets to go out in search of butterflies. The student, anxious about a forthcoming exam in Nabokov's class, asked him what she needed to know. Nabokov responded, "Life is beautiful. Life is sad. That is all you need to know." Both Nick and Gabe expertly navigate in their writing the paradoxes of life's beauty and sadness. Yet they also expand on this paradox. In their work, life is also funny and absurd. It is layered and meaningful and worthy of inquiry. Perhaps most of all, like Nabokov's butterflies, it is elusive and mysterious, forever in motion against being caught or pinned. Following their readings, Nick and Gabe will respond to questions from the audience. Many of you provided excellent questions for the authors when you registered for the event, and you will also be able to submit questions this evening by posting them to the question and answer box on the site. As moderator, I will relay these questions to the authors. We have also provided links should you wish to purchase the collections from which the authors will read this evening. Please join me in welcoming Gabriel Blackwell and Nickalus Rupert.
Well, thank you so much, John, and thank you to the department. Thank you, of course, also to Anna and Brandy. I am going to read a bit, I'm going to read a very short story on Thanksgiving Day last year, because it's from a British press and the British don't really care about Thanksgiving. And then because I like all of you so much, I am also going to give you a sneak preview of this book, Correction. This will be out next month. So the story I'm going to read from Babel is called La Tortue, or the Tortoise. Decades ago, in fact, only a few months after I was born, though of course thousands of miles away and as thoroughly unrelated to my birth as a butterfly's stretched wings to a distant hurricane, the French publisher Gallimard brought out a collection of texts attributed to Jorge Luis Borges called La Tortue, or the Tortoise. At least according to the book's description, none of its essays, fictions, or unclassifiable prose, the translation is mine, I should say, as are any mistakes in it, or any of the translations that follow. None of them appear in Borges's Obras Completas, and thus their discovery, in French translation no less, ought naturally to have been an event. The book's fate was, however, otherwise. La Tortue was printed, but never distributed, its publisher or its editor perhaps having had a change of heart regarding its authenticity. There are no court documents to rely on now. There is no documentation of any kind. There are rumors, naturally, but the rumors are of recent origin and so less reliable. Copies are said to exist, for example, unread and unsold in a warehouse in a suburb of Paterson, New Jersey, and why a French edition of an obscure work said to be by an Argentinian writer would remain unread and unsold in an unnamed New Jersey township is, it seems to me, completely understandable, but why such books would have come to be there in the first place is considerably more of a mystery. My efforts to locate the exact site of this warehouse have so far come to nothing. In an essay whose title I haven't been able to find, appearing on page 175 of La Tortue and at one time accessible via Google Books, Borges writes, "It is a species of melancholy to have to do with books that have met with such a fate." The page this quote appears on is the only page of this particular essay to make it into Google's preview. Most of the page is devoted to an enumeration of the various editions of the Bible and the degree to which the apocryphal Gospels are integrated into them, yet the Bible isn't the subject of the sentence. What fate is Borges speaking of? Which books? I don't suppose I have to say why I found this particular passage so intriguing. There are 15 pages total in Google's preview of La Tortue, but no ordering or library holding information, no ebook offerings, and seemingly no way to know how Google's scanner got his or her hands on the thing. Nor is there any information about why the book was assembled in the first place, the more important question, it seems to me. According to the pages I was able to access, La Tortue includes, among other things, a review of the book Unwitnessed Spectacles, 1890 to 1900, a book that doesn't seem to exist, but which apparently details such phenomenon as the washing up of two mermaids in advanced stages of decay on North Avenue Beach, Chicago, the opening and closing of a sinkhole 100 yards across in Jordan, and Marconi's transmission from the SS St. Paul of the entire text of De Quincey's Suspiria de Profundis. La Tortue also includes a list of untranslatable texts. For instance, the schizophrenic A.A. Barnes's English rendered phonetically into French, Achille Lise, along with a commentary on the proper construction of temporary structures meant to collapse, like those in Buster Keaton's Steamboat Bill Jr. and Gene Epstein's La Chute de la Maison Usher. There are at least 256 pages in the volume, as the last page that appears in the preview is numbered 255, and the last sentence there reads, "Of all the books I have sent to press, none is more personal than this motley, disorganized," obviously concluding on the following page, ending mid-thought as it does. I probably don't need to remind you that Google's preview function doesn't allow the reader to control which selection is chosen and that that selection may change over time. For example, at the time of this writing, I can't check whether what I have transcribed above is accurate, as page 255 is no longer part of my preview. I've rechecked the preview often over the past month, hoping to be able to read more of the text, but the same 15 pages show up each time, and these again are not the same as the 15 pages that I just first discovered in the book when I began writing this essay. Given the empirical evidence, then, I must conclude that if I were to check the preview every day for the rest of my life, I would see the same 15 pages. But if I were to leave the thing alone and only check it, say, once more on the day I died, perhaps I would see a further 15 pages, having thus read over my lifetime only a fifth of La Tortue. Granted, my knowledge of the inner workings and algorithms of Google Books is non-existent. Just a moment ago, my wife called to me from downstairs. "Honey," she said, "the children are waiting." They will all be arranged around the dinner table, a plain pine table chosen for its simplicity and now scarred at its ankles by the dog's incessant chewing, two sets of hungry eyes centered above matching Donald Duck plates, and my wife's eyes, urgent, tired from her long day of caring for the children, all of them, that is, except for the youngest, who will be set back a bit in his high chair, a bib around his neck, and a Diego sippy cup affixed to his hand, unless he has thrown it, the cup I mean, to get my wife's attention. They will wait for me to be seated before eating, a rule my wife invented, that we all be together before the meal starts. They will even wait long after the dishes have been set down steaming in the middle of the table. In my imagination, they will wait forever, though I know this isn't so, and I wonder at my fantasized cruelty. Who am I? even to myself. If the food gets cold, they will complain, of course, and my wife will be upset with me, but still I think they will wait. Again, except for the youngest who's already eaten. I'll get up from my desk, piled high with books I will never read, and I will cross my office to the recently oiled, but still creaking door, just barely cracked, so that I can be called to dinner, but mostly closed so the children will know not to bother me, and I will open the door, and I will walk down the hall to the top of the stairs, and I will take hold of the banister, loose and runneled from the children sliding down it, and I will descend the 13 steps to the first floor, and I will cross the hall to the kitchen, passing the dining room to get the salt shaker or the pepper grinder or the water jug or any forgotten thing, and I will ask my wife and children from my place in the kitchen if there's anything anyone needs. And then finally, I will enter the dining room, and my children will smile or look at their plates depending on how long it has taken me to do all these things. And then I'll sit and I will tell them about Borges' lost book, or anyway, the book attributed to Borges, but which may not exist and may not have been written by Borges. But first I will have to command certain muscles to extend and other muscles to contract so that I may rise from my desk, which anyhow is covered in old yellowed bills and empty envelopes, not books. And before I can do that, I must have the impulse to rise, which just now is too much to ask, I think, for I've been hungry for days and I've had very little to eat. And perhaps more importantly for this essay, I must have a desk to rise from, a desk and a chair. And I must have work that demands time at that desk. And so I must have some sort of education, perhaps some sort of experience in order to get such work. And before I forget, I must also have a wife and children. And so I cannot begin, because at present only some of those things have been accomplished, and not even necessarily the most important, such as the children, who exist only in my imagination. Since before one can have children, one must have a kind of hope. And my wife and I have instead in its place debts, for I'm a mostly scholar, and she is employed by a temporary agency as a file clerk, and we are neither one of us in good health. And so we have not started the family. We should have started long ago because I am nearing middle age and she is not far behind, and we live childless in an apartment that is much too cold and too small even for the two of us and completely unsuitable for children. This is a source of much friction between us, and we spend the nights we ought to spend dreaming together, each on our own side of the bed, lying awake with our separate worries, hers more serious than mine, owing to certain health problems, making pregnancy a complicated and even dangerous proposition, but mine still strong enough to wake me at 4 a.m. when there's absolutely nothing else to do but think about what has yet to be done, how much further there is to go, how little time there is left for any of us, really, but for the two of us most of all. Okay. So this book, Correction, this is a little bit of a tone change. This book, Correction, is made up of 101 very short stories and essays. And so I'm going to start with one of these, an essay that takes place in Pensacola. It's called Black and Blue, and it may or may not sound familiar to you. The other 4 men could not agree on what precisely ninja stuff meant, so they showed up at the couple's home wearing black and dark blue. When none of the 5 could get the safe open, they took claw hammers to the couple's heads and hauled the safe away. Opened, it contained exactly $3 million less than the $3 million the guy had promised. Instead, inside, there were insurance papers, some jewels, and many bottles of pills with the names of the couple's adopted children, all with special needs, the news said, carefully printed on them in Sharpie. A jeweler later informed one of the men that the stones he brought in were paste, polished leaded glass, and that the jewelry was therefore of sentimental value only, if that. Not knowing what else to do, the men buried the safe in the ringleader's mother's yard. She said that at first she'd been happy to see her son. He hadn't been by the house in a while, but she'd known something was wrong when he hustled her out the door for what he said would be a quick trip to the mall, promising her his friends would remember to take the casserole out of the oven when the dinger dinged. They didn't. The mess it made in the pan was awful, she said. And not only that, but when she went out to water them, she saw that her son's friends must have been in the bed where she had put her spring plantings because the mulch looked on the flowers were a bit droopy. What had been doing out there, she wondered. To be honest, she didn't much like her son's friends. When the pansies died a week later, she investigated with her trowel. She said she thought maybe her son's parakeet Chester had been buried in that planter, but she was sure it would have been in an old shoebox, not something metal. The neighbor she called over to help her unearth the huge thing was naturally a sheriff's deputy. The bed was ruined. The woman I was seeing would later ask when she heard the story on some podcast she was listening to why I hadn't told her the story when I'd heard it. You know, I like that kind of thing, she said. This had all come up because when she started to retell me the story she'd heard, I told her, oh, right, the real humdinger. The real humdinger being the phrase the sheriff had used to describe either the crime or the perpetrators. At that point, I think I'd forgotten which it was. And she said, yeah, how did you know? As though I'd betrayed her. Later, I would think that if this was all we were keeping from each other, things must have been pretty good then. And this one is called fact checking. There is, for instance, the story, a true story. One can find it in an article about fact checking at the New Yorker, written for the New Yorker. The story arises in an interview with one of the magazine's fact checkers, and so one may presume that the story was itself fact checked by the New Yorker and found free of error about a longtime reader of the New Yorker, referred to in an issue of the New Yorker as the late reader of the New Yorker, who, seeing himself referred to in the past tense, then wrote to the New Yorker to explain that he was in fact still very much alive, still reading the New Yorker, though perhaps with somewhat more caution than in the past, and whose note requesting a correction, along with the correction, of course, was printed in the next issue of the New Yorker, which issue was delivered to newsstands and to this longtime reader's mailbox at the nursing home, unfortunately, just a day or two too late, since he'd passed away over the weekend while the issue was being printed. Can there really be a correction of a correction, or does that immediately devolve into a contradiction in terms? One wonders, I mean, whether one's feelings about such a story are not also a comment on one's feelings about how life ought to be lived. This one is called Bedtime. I told my son a disappointing story. A story, he said, that was no good. That wasn't very good, he said. Deadly serious and not at all tired. Not that I had so much invested in this story, but I wasn't sure where to look for a moment. For a moment, and this will be unflattering, I think, I wondered if maybe it wasn't the story after all. A pretty good one, I thought, exactly like the one he'd liked so much the night before, just with different animals and a little girl instead of a little boy. And I thought maybe he would have said this after any story I told that night, no matter how good, which is to say that, for a fraction of a second, I wondered about my true motivations, which is also to say that I wondered if it wasn't so much the story I told as that I'd told it, and not, I mean, his mother. And so I inhaled and held my breath for just long enough to calm myself, but not so long that it would alarm my son. And then I asked him to tell me a story, and he did. He told me a story about a fish. We'd been to the aquarium the weekend before, who was friends with Hal, his toy dog, who were both, for reasons that were unclear to me, in a sort of running conflict with a shark who wore a trench coat. I wondered how he knew what a trench coat was. I didn't own one, and his mother didn't either. Life was like this now, complicated. It was over very quickly, and I couldn't follow it at all. That was a good story, I said, because there were things in it I thought were interesting or clever, like the way the shark tied his trench coat together with a bedsheet to escape from Hal at the end. The look on my son's face when I said this had a kind of sureness I would later envy. Now you go, he said. You know, I don't know if my wife has told you this, but our son originally had a twin. I remember we had a set of names picked out, one for a boy and one for a girl, and then bang, twins. What, my wife asked, if they were two boys, two girls? Now, all of a sudden, we were having a fight we'd already had over a name she'd wanted me to consider, but that I didn't really like. She felt I wasn't listening to her, and I felt she was bullying me. I remember I wondered in the car with my wife she was driving whether we'd treat the twin with the second choice name differently from the one with the name we both agreed on. And maybe I meant I'd treat that twin differently, though I doubted my wife would just forget our argument or behave as though it hadn't happened. But then at our next ultrasound, there was only one fetus. Sometimes it happens, the doctor told us. When I stupidly asked what had happened to the other fetus, the doctor said, it has been absorbed. This was a thing to think about, I thought. The other twin had been absorbed by either its brother or its mother. I had enough sense not to say this aloud. Just two more, and they are very short. So this one is called All a Dream. The woman, newly single, logged in to post an account of her dream the previous night. In her dream, she wrote, a dragon or some very large lizard had abducted her child. I am not Preggers, BTW, she added. This was just in the dream, lulz. And she had to rescue it with the help of three very short men armed with three very short knives, daggers, she guessed. She tagged three of her male friends in her post, but added in a comment that she promised she didn't think they were short. It was just that the faces of the men in her dream had somehow reminded her of these men. Not that the men looked like them, but Anyway, in the dream, she wrote, she and these three men with daggers were climbing a very tall mountain, which was, as they went up it, somehow constantly getting taller, the peak always receding further into the distance. It was only when the woman announced, "We can't keep going like this," that the mountain's height finally seemed to stabilize. Now the peak and the cave where the woman somehow knew the child was being held by the lizard monster got closer and closer and closer. Unfortunately, just at that moment, it started to rain, and the woman and the three men were drenched, and the ground underneath them became very slippery. One man, the one with the shortest dagger, slid off the side of the mountain and into the abyss. Paging Dr. Freud, the woman wrote. In the dream, the woman told her two companions, "We'll never make it." At that instant, though, the sun came out and the group hit a dry patch on the trail. Now the woman realized in the dream, she wrote, that she hadn't actually seen the dragon or lizard or whatever abducting her child. What if, she now thought in the dream, what if they all got to the top and there was no child to be rescued and this man's death was on her conscience? In the dream, she said, she reasoned it would be a bigger mistake to turn around before at least making the attempt to rescue the child. Wouldn't the men be even angrier if they turned around now and it was that much more obvious it had all been for nothing? But with every step, she grew more and more concerned that perhaps the child was at home, safe. And she and these three, now two, men were doing something both very dangerous and completely unnecessary. The wind picked up, the woman wrote, just as she imagined her child at home in its crib, and horrified, the woman and one of the men clutched each other, watching the other man fly straight out from the path, as though being pulled on a string. So now, in the woman's dream, there was just this one man. The woman said that in her dream, she had then, for reasons she didn't completely understand, tried to imagine the crib she had just thought of, the crib where she worried her child was even then resting, and realized she couldn't visualize it. It was wooden, she thought, unless maybe it was metal or plastic. It was rectangular, or was it oval shaped? Was it handmade, or was it one of those no tools required deals? And was there even actually a crib? She discovered in the dream that she now felt unsure. She and the man arrived at the empty cave at the mountain's peak. It didn't look as if anything had ever lived there. Had the woman in her dream even had a child? One of the woman's former coworkers, a man she hadn't known well even when they worked together, commented on the post, hashtag Dwarf Lives Matter. 30 minutes later, when his comment had received only one like, he replied to his own comment, JK, hashtag All Lives Matter. He would later claim this too was a joke. Just look at my last 3 posts, he wrote, and replied to one of the woman's friends. And in the middle of an important sales meeting, the phone of one of the men the woman had tagged in her post rattled in his pocket with notification after notification after notification. I'm sorry, he told his colleagues. My little girl's in the hospital. I have to keep it on, in case. Everyone in the room felt the same obligation to have the right thing to say. Okay, and this is the last one, and then you will hear from Nick. This one's called Florida Man. It was while watching the news report filmed in the next neighborhood over, not even 2 miles from where he lived, that the professor of anthropology finally understood that in spite of his political leanings and his upbringing in a northeastern state, in spite of his education at a West Coast university and his still relatively recent settlement here on the opposite side of the country, which he tended to add as though an apology he had done for the job, which was, after all, in a field where positions were exceedingly rare. At any moment, he now saw, he might, without warning, be made exotic, even mythical, to the rest of the country. He might, for instance, be standing in his bathroom, staring into the mirror, reaching for the toothbrush, barely half awake, when the floor beneath him suddenly gave way. If, he reflected, as he watched the televised water swirling under the sunburned man's lifted truck, there were animals living underneath underneath his own house, a raccoon, a skunk, snakes, or if he was only partly clothed or entirely naked, it would become possible for him to read about himself on the web the following day, as though his state of residence were the only concrete fact in his biography, more solid even than his name. If he got in a wreck, as he almost had on his move out here with the Oscar Mayer hot dog mobile, he would find pictures of his ruined car shared on friends' walls, on friends of friends' walls, in the things people he knew had liked, and even in the news forecast to come through that week dropped not inches, but instead feet of water on his yard, engulfing his home. The clips of his Weather Channel interview could be set to music and his voice auto-tuned to fit the melody. If he happened to discover walking along the fence in the man's yard next door, the man with the very large collection of junked automobiles, a reptile of prodigious size, and especially if that reptile had a collar around its neck, or if that reptile were kept in an above-ground pool, its eyes milky from chlorine or other chemicals, he could easily wind up on all the front pages of all the most popular news aggregators, at least for a day, as part of a listicle. If he was robbed at gunpoint by some former celebrity brought down in the world by drugs or drinking or gambling or some other addiction, he could, he knew, appear in the supposedly targeted ads at the bottom of any number of websites, the so-called chum box, identified there solely by two words, neither of which his first name, and neither of which would be his last name. When he showed up to protest the man his neighbors had sent to Congress, the man who had voted against hurricane relief for victims in another state just 3 days before a major hurricane was forecast to come ashore in their own state, he could not help but think of himself as something more than a demographic or stereotype. There was still then a sense, he would later tell the reporter covering the story of the woman stuck in the toilet at the fish tossing festival. His interview was not broadcast. The sweaty man with the bright red hats was, that unless and until he had been entangled in some debasing, tragic spectacle, he would somehow escape this essential aspect of himself. Thank you.
Oh man, John definitely should have positioned me as the opening band tonight. But I'm going to read from the title story of my collection, Bosses of Light and Sound. And I won't have time to get through the entire story, but I think I'll be able to get pretty far into it. So I'm just going to start. This is Bosses of Light and Sound. The story begins in 2003, where it ends. Look at Kelly. Look at her in the sunlight. You're not used to seeing her outside the theater, and you're struck by the way her eyes grab the light, the middle's crackling gold. The story also begins in July of 2001. Kelly sits at the Valley Cinema's projectionist desk on the second floor. She wears black pants and a red shirt that's turning pink from overwashing. The shirt's front pocket is embroidered with Valley Cinemas and the company logo, a jagged line that's supposed to contour a series of mountainous peaks and valleys, though it looks more like the EKG of a coked up heart. Kelly is bored, and she's still young enough to believe that her boredom is special. She has one of those faces that makes it seem like she's always pissed off, but, and here's what's so unfortunate about Kelly, she's practically never pissed off. Not even a week from now, when Brody, her ex-boyfriend, shows up to the theater holding hands with Misty Caldwell, and later that same night, she looks down through one of the projection windows and sees in the otherwise empty theater someone who could only be Brody slung way back in his seat with Misty's blonde head doing a rhythmic bob over his lap. I'm still here in 2001, still stuck on Kelly's scowl. It's something in the eyebrows, I think. Too much tense muscle tissue. Maybe the scowl is why management have put her in projection. Run afoul of the high school blondes in concession and management will stick you somewhere else. Kelly has nothing but kind things to say about those girls, but she has definitely failed to fit in somehow, or she wouldn't be up here. Maybe the GM, Tina, figures Kelly doesn't have the right mug for slinging popcorn at 800% markup. That's a job for the bubbly ones. Kelly is closing tonight, which means she won't get to leave the theater parking lot until well after midnight. The sprawling dark of the projection hall is sentineled by 8 projectors gunning 5,000 watts of light and movie magic at flat white screens. Each projector's quartz bulb contains several atmospheres of pressure and burns hot enough to melt right through celluloid should the film snag, which Kelly hopes it won't. She spends long hours sitting at the projectionist desk, which is located sort of mid-hallway in a neutral zone between shattering machines. On the wall over the desk, there's a dry erase board that we projectionists use to delegate work and leave each other notices, like number 3 needs oil, or number 6 has been cold starting. Mostly, though, we use the board to sketch places we'd rather be. Tonight, Kelly illustrates the cosmos, with the rings of Saturn well defined. It's not so noisy here at the desk, and Kelly has her portable CD player and a pair of desktop speakers. She's still in her Pink Floyd phase and can't stop playing Welcome to the Machine. She doesn't connect with the hip indie rock that the girls downstairs like, and she really doesn't connect with the pitch perfect pop music that her other friends are always talking about. Kelly plays some guitar. Years later, she will start listening to Riot Girl and form a band of her own. Brain Rap, a moderately successful punk trio. Then she will mellow out, start smoking more pot, go through her Joni Mitchell phase. But for now, Pink Floyd. The back wall of the hallway comes alive with lambent, inverse images of movie heroes, cataphracted sea monsters, homicidal robots on parade. These images are not magical, and Kelly isn't hallucinating. She's witnessing one of those unintended visual tricks that happens as the projected images vault off the window glass and create a backwash of light, a paradox of the projection hall. Always crowded, always lonesome. Sit here with Kelly in the dark of this endless hallway. Look at the clutter of simulacra bounding along the back wall. A computer-rendered mummy stutters and quakes, then gets snapped away. Listen as the projectors chew their miles of film, a low-end grumble punctuated by the same Floyd cut, which is stuck on repeat, winding as it unwinds. Sometimes Kelly misses that sense of wonder she used to feel as a guest here at Valley Cinemas, before she got the job. She used to love how the tiny lights made a kind of airport runway down the aisle, or how the house lights burned way down into their sconces before the trailers went on, or the mystery of that dark window glass on the rear wall, images tumbling out like hot laundry. She no longer feels that sense of mystery, but she accepts that she's the sort of person who always has to know how things work, while all those guests in the theater still get to wonder who controls the house lights. Kelly does, with a tiny switch located below each projector's window. Or what that runny orange popcorn topping really is. Hydrogenated palm oil, mostly. Spielberg's AI is the last movie playing tonight, and there's still a thick ring of film that has to play through the projector before Kelly can leave. That ring is her timepiece. The movie is a long one, and there's only one guest in the entire auditorium. In Kelly's opinion, the movie isn't very good. The third act is loaded with pseudo endings, and if there's one thing Kelly distrusts, it's a pseudo ending. She wants to go to the beach and drink a few beers under the stars with her friends, who aren't going to wait all night. She wants to play that Floyd track for them. She's even thinking about getting the lyrics tattooed across her hip. So Kelly turns up the projector's audio monitor and listens very carefully. She waits for the first of many pseudo endings when there's a bit of a silence and a brief fade out, and she cuts the projector off there, mid-roll, with some 20 minutes of endings left to go. Up come the house lights, and that's that. The story ends in August of 2003 when Kelly and I get caught. Tina, our manager, does the catching. Tina can't stomach legitimate booze, so she dabbles in more obscure dependencies, like passion flower extract, which she drinks on the rocks with just a splash of soda water and salt. You can't really blame Tina, who's older and sadder than Kelly and me. She can't appreciate the profound ennui that afflicts projectionists. Tina has a theater to manage. She has her nasty divorce to brood over and relive. It's in my nature and Kelly's to project, to provide a few rings of cartilage to slip between the ossified facts and keep them from grinding together. Sometimes we can sort of guess our way inside people's heads using simple algorithms of human behavior. We can tell, for instance, that Tina was unhappy long before the divorce, which in a way she needed, so she'd have a reason to drink her flower water. Sometimes we can even project forward in time and work out a shaky impression of the future. For example, Kelly and I have to get caught. Worse yet, to some extent, we probably want to get caught. We've already spoiled the ending, but if you're willing to see things the way Kelly and I see them, focusing on what happens during the telling and the retelling, then there's a sense that we're still up there in the projection hall, where we belong. We're bending light and sound, and we're uncaught. Our doctored films play on, snaking from one platter to another, winding and unwinding. The unwinding is what winds them back up. Business at Valley Cinemas is steady during May of 2003. In 6 years, digital projectors will become more or less industry standard, and our jobs will be obsolete. For now, though, we're still working with actual film. We're familiar with film's glossy texture. We know the confident schwick sound of the splicer's blade as it makes a clean cut, and we feel maybe a little too cocky for our own good. Though there are other projectionists on staff, we're the head projectionists. We rule the top floor, the brains, really, of Valley Cinemas, which is located hundreds of miles from any significant valleys. Look at Kelly and her involuntary scowl. It's 2003 and the projectionist desk is mostly the same. Kelly draws the Rocky Mountains on the dry erase board with blue rivers knifing through the valleys. She has passed through her Floyd stage and moved on to more modern stuff, like Fiona Apple. Radiohead's Hail to the Thief has just been released, but if you ask Kelly, it's no OK Computer. One night at shift change, Kelly hangs around while I complain about the industry's recent trend for films so long they overhang their platters like prehistoric steaks. I mentioned how the last Rings movie ran for a full 228 minutes of gloomy hobbits tottering around on their weird pubic-looking feet. Kelly explains that 2 years ago, she lost her patience and stopped AI in its sorry tracks. I think I actually improved the movie, she says. This news affects me on a molecular level. Kelly has cheated time, has dumped an extra 20 minutes of grit into the cosmic hourglass. I can feel the earth wobbling under my feet, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. Feel what Kelly and I feel, standing at that little desk. Project a little. Some of these films are just begging to be trimmed, tampered with. Too congested, too earnest, too studio perfect. By the end of June 2003, Kelly is bored with disaster films. She parks the splicer on the desk and spools up a trailer that opens with a long establishing shot of urban Americans drinking salted caramel frappuccinos outside a crowded cafe, then romping in the park with friendly looking dogs. Everyone seems pretty content with being undestroyed, but then the voice man starts in with his "something went wrong" spiel. Turns out that solar so-and-so has thrown off the moon's gravitational field. The tides on Earth go wonky, and America's eastern seaboard gets pancaked by computerized waves. The Statue of Liberty gets shoved inland, then dragged out to sea, and soon after, it's decided that Bruce Willis and Will Smith have to take a crash course in astrophysics and then fly up there and fix it. Fix the moon. Kelly wants to disarm the trailer, though not in a spiteful way. Not in a way that disturbs people or draws extra attention to how corny the movie is, which would be way too easy. Remember what she says about that Spielberg clunker. I think I actually improved the movie. When Kelly's doctored version of the trailer cues up, most of North America is already a bird bath. Tidal waves have trimmed the eastern seaboard, and the Statue of Liberty has gone swimming. Bruce Willis and Will Smith have been dicking around on the moon, throwing off its polarity. Lots of people have drowned, and the undrowned are oaring around in tubs and makeshift rafts. There's a meeting among important-looking suits, one of whom is the president, and it's decided that Will Smith and Bruce Willis need to stop putzing around on the moon and come down, post-haste. So they head back to Earth, and all the undrowned citizens cry and embrace because it's such a noble sacrifice. The moon goes back to normal, and the flood never happened. The Statue of Liberty is back on its mount. People romp in the park with their dogs. Then they drink frappuccinos outside a crowded cafe. I don't think Kelly wants to ruin the magic of cinema for the audience. She wants to tell a better story. By July, we've lost interest in trailer manipulation. We're ready to tackle the feature-length stuff. So Kelly cuts a whopping 23 minutes out of the latest Pirates sequel. Pretty bold, but if Kelly has a flaw, it's that she's powerless to ruin a film. Even when she tries to be malicious, she makes improvements. I watched both cuts of Pirates, Kelly's and the director's, and Kelly's makes more sense. We start scene swapping. Pirates make cameos in dystopian science fiction films. Daniel Day-Lewis shows up in Finding Nemo. Certain conventions emerge. An establishing shot of a county fair must be spliced into each movie we play. On the other hand, any establishing shots that include steaming big city manhole covers must be spliced out immediately because enough already. Sometimes we make changes for purely aesthetic reasons. Even for movies we like, if a certain scene lags or a certain actor isn't on point, we cut. By all rights, we improve plenty of films. The problem is we can't seem to recapture that newly minted feeling that Kelly pulled off with her edited disaster trailer. That first manipulation was like slicing through the cellophane of a new album and catching a whiff of that factory weather. But now a whiff isn't enough. We start showing up to work on days we're not scheduled, just to get some splicing in. To avoid Tina's detection, which isn't really all that keen, Kelly and I smuggle one another into projection through the fire escape door. One oppressively warm night, the air in the hallway takes on a carbonated quality, a staticky pre-lightning crackle that makes it clear that something big needs to happen. We have to innovate splice-wise, or we might collapse. Kelly gets the proper high-stilted chair, while I take a mangled, low-slung auditorium seat that we were supposed to repair back in June. Because it's hot outside, Kelly illustrates the glassy blue ice floes of Antarctica on the dry erase board. The mangled seat inspires Kelly. She takes apart an old trailer and runs sequences upside down, backwards, or both. I name her new technique full inversion. There's a campy samurai flick opening next week, and we think that it might make the perfect testing ground. To take the edge off, Kelly and I smoke a joint out on the fire escape. But if anything, the greenish smoke only sobers me. Pure swag, probably plucked from somebody's lawn, though the smoke makes Kelly nice and chatty. It's totally hollow, she says, pointing at the moon. So you're one of those, I say, eager to debunk whatever conspiracy theory she's about to pitch. Silly boy, she says. I mean, like, conceptually hollow. The moon wears whatever face you put on it. That's why it shows up in so many poems and movies. God damn, I say, squinting up at the sky. Is that Will Smith up there? Bruce Willis is driving the Rover, she says. We head back inside where I sink into the lowrider auditorium seat. Kelly looks good and bleary from where I'm sitting. She beats her skinny fists to Fiona Apple's mock Stepford vocals, and she keeps grinning at me. Before the song ends, Kelly slides off the chair and scoots next to me. She folds a cut of film the size of a bookmark and bends the cells into a loopy figure. The sign for infinity, she says. I was trying to imagine a projector that just kept cycling the same piece of film, feeding the end back into the beginning. Looks more like an ampersand, I say. Kelly smiles and swats me across the chest, causing her little infinity of film to come unbound. Her eyes are all dope softened and slow to blink. Fiona warbles from the desktop. Kelly isn't scowling anymore, and even if she was, her scowl isn't really a scowl. She leans over and whispers into my ear, breath all smoky with dreg weed. What if it all just keeps going? She says. A good projectionist knows that it can't all just keep going. We are not the shapers of our own infinite clay. A good projectionist knows that the end is already there, inscribed on the last tailing of film that waits to peel off the platter and curve through the projector. How it ends. Kelly and I grow up and move on. We find middling jobs and generous spouses. Often we think of that projection hall and its ghosted walls, those stuttering projectors with their bellies full of stroboscopic light. We think of sad old Tina, drunk on essential oils, and we wonder if she ever got better. Mostly, though, we remember having nerve enough to tamper with the rightful property of some pretty powerful film studios. Remembering makes us smile. And when our respective spouses ask why we're smiling, we say, oh, nothing. I keep tabs on Kelly's band until they break up, but I never get to see one of her shows. Truth be told, I'm not nuts about her music, which sounds angry for the sake of angry. Kelly keeps a close eye on the webpage of my photography business, but I don't know that she does. She never posts comments or anything. Eventually, Kelly lands an editing job at a small-time firm that produces local television commercials. She's a savant, so she heads west with the other savants and starts working on Hollywood films. The move becomes a strain on her marriage, as you might imagine. Kelly carries her scowl out west, but once there, she decorates her arms with tattoos that, surprisingly, soften up her image and make her scowl more endearing. One of her tattoos is a well-cratered moon, and if you look closely, not even her spouse ever does, you can make out Bruce Willis and Will Smith roaming one of its craters. Some nights, if we've been into the wine, Kelly and I stay up late and type long texts that don't get sent. It's awkward trying to make conversation after so long, not knowing where to start, how much to say, or what tone might be appropriate. Once we've keyed in our messages, we sort of let our texting fingers float in the air. About an inch from that send button, about 1.5 miles from that send button. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I'm sure I'm pretty much at the time limit. But I definitely, before I shut up, I definitely wanted to thank John Fink and Anna and also Gabe for allowing me to participate. This has just been super fun. So thank you all.
Thank you, Nick and Gabe. That was wonderful. I know how challenging it is just to read into a computer and not get the rhythms of an audience and those responses back. And it's just, you did a wonderful job. Thank you both for just sharing that with us. We have a range of questions. I sort of view this as like a conversation to respond to each other as well, and you know, to the questions that have come in. We have some that were presented beforehand that are kind of for both of you about the writing process, and then some specific questions about your individual work. So one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time that I thought was a good one to start with is audience member asked, what risks have you taken with your writing that have paid off?
Yeah.
So we'll start with Gabe on this one, and then we can go to Nick, and then we'll flip it on the next one.
Okay. What risks have I taken with my writing? I think one of the most important things that happened to me when I was a graduate student many, many years ago was that I had a professor who told me basically just, you know, write whatever you're interested in, write about things that you actually are interested in. And I'm interested in really dumb stuff. And so I'd never written about that kind of stuff before, because I figured this is really dumb stuff. People are not going to be into it to the same degree I am. But he was right. You know, writing about things that were not interesting to me or were not like things that I was super into, the writing itself was much less interesting to me. You know, I mean, the process of writing about it was not very interesting to me. And so I know it's kind of I don't know, it feels like a dodge to answer that way about a risk I took. But for me at that time, it was a risk. You know, I was in workshops with other writers who expected a certain kind of story to be presented to them. And I was writing about robot dinosaurs you know, kickboxers and stuff. And you know, to their credit, they took it, you know, as serious work. Not sure that I would have considered it that myself, but in any case, a risk I took that I think paid off. You know, here I am.
Yeah, no, that's great, Gabe. Absolutely. You know, it reminds me of Steve Martin was being interviewed one time, and he was talking about one of the things that really opened up for him was when his first movie came out. They were doing a focus group. I think it was The Jerk, maybe when The Jerk came out, and they told him in the focus group, the guy said, look, I conduct all these things. One thing you need to realize is that every movie is a cult movie. Like, there's no such thing as universal appeal, even though you have that expectation. And he said for him, that completely opened him up. And I think that's absolutely right what you're saying about that permission, right, to write about.
Yes.
Compels you. Yeah. Nick, how about you? Thoughts on this about risk that have paid off?
Yeah, I'll share just a short little anecdote from my PhD program. And I won't name the professor because it's not really important, but throughout my PhD career as a student, I had one professor in particular who, no matter what I turned in, kind of said, you're not taking any risks. You know, you've never submitted anything that scared me. And I just got that every time. And I think at a certain point, it must have gotten under my skin. And I kind of decided, okay, I'm going to write something just really risky. And that ended up being a story that's in this collection. It's a story titled Ant Job. And I won't even lower the real estate value of this event by talking about it. But I mean, just suffice it to say, it's kind of a story that's in terribly bad taste. And I can tell you, I never really thought it would even be published. And not only did it get published, it's probably one of my better publications. That story ended up in a pushcart anthology, which is hilarious to me. So I think maybe that's a good example of the benefit of taking risks, because I've written so many other stories that are maybe a little bit more tasteful. I might even argue that they're better stories. And, you know, maybe they get published, but no one really has much to say about them. So yeah, it might be a good idea to just go for it and do something a little bit reckless.
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. a couple of other questions that have come in previously, maybe connected to this. Nick, we'll start with you on this one. They're asking, does ego ultimately help you or hurt you as a writer?
I think it's a complicated question. And I think if we're being honest, there's got to be some narcissism at play, right? If you're going to put some words on a page under the assumption, yeah, this has value, someone's going to read it and feel like, it's important enough to read multiple times or publish, there's probably like at least a small amount of narcissism at play. One of my favorite quotes about writers, it was in a documentary about screenwriters. And the idea was basically like writers are egomaniacs with low self-esteem, which I just found that really funny. I'm not saying it's true necessarily, but I find that kind of funny. I ultimately think if I could find like my perfect state of mind as a writer, it would actually be kind of a state where the ego is extinguished, where you're getting outside of that. So I don't know how hip it is to reference T.S. Eliot these days, but I always liked T.S. Eliot's argument about, you're almost trying to extinguish personality and move away from ego and find something more interesting. But I don't know, there's probably some ego at play.
Yeah, Gabe, what did you think?
I don't know if I have a whole lot to say about ego, but I will say that stubbornness is very important to being a writer if you want to be published. And you need to be stubborn. It's also obviously a big obstacle in one's life outside of writing, but it can be really helpful to most publishing writers. I think are stubborn to some degree or another. I'm certainly stubborn.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the concept of ego too, I often find that a lot of times students, when they're first working on stories, they think that the goal is to kind of remove themselves from the piece, right? And you can always feel that in their writing, right? Or to remove their voice or their instincts, and invariably once they sort of embrace themselves and stop trying to assume some other voice in their own, the work becomes better, right? What about some of the questions that were specific to each of you? Gabe, one of the audience members asked, can you talk a little bit about your story, The Disappearance of the Island, and what kind of thought went into this story?
Sure. So the second story in Babel, which was the first book that I read from, is called The Invention of an Island. And the title itself is taken from two books. So The Invention of Morel, which was written by a writer named Adolfo Bioy Casares, is a fantastic book. It's also really short. So if you're looking for something to read, but you don't want to give a big commitment to a book, I can certainly recommend that one. But it was kind of itself playing with an earlier book called The Island of Dr. Moreau, a very famous book, right? So most people have heard of that. And so the story itself, The Invention of an Island, takes ideas from both of those books and adds in a story about a man who is kind of being sealed into an apartment that is completely covered in mirrors. And it makes a lot more sense, in the story than in me summarizing the story. But as far as the idea or the reason that I started writing the story, it was mainly just because I love those books and I wanted to more fully engage with them. And this story was the form that took.
One element that's connected to that, Gabe, is how, like you mentioned, your forthcoming book is both essays and stories together. And then even in the pieces you read, it's not immediately clear to a reader if this is going to move in the direction of an essay or a story, right? So you began the piece talking about the previously undiscovered collection, and then all of a sudden it transitions to a scene at the table, right? And it's connected in some ways to what you're saying about this relationship of beginning with the books that you read and having that morph into its own story. Did you have maybe a couple of thoughts too about the relationship of essays and stories and genre?
I have, I probably have thoughts about genre. I think for myself as a writer, I'm really interested in story and telling stories. And, sometimes those stories are true and sometimes they're made up, and sometimes they're kind of in between, I guess. And so in terms of like me sitting down to write something, I almost never sit down and say, I'm going to write an essay, because that to me it would not be interesting enough to sustain my interest. It wouldn't be something that I could finish. In fact, I'm just having this problem. Had some people ask me to please submit an essay about something to coincide with the release of this next book coming out next month. And I couldn't do it. It was so boring to me to be, okay, now write an essay. I wanted something that was a little bit more free. So, if it ended up taking a fictional turn, then it was a fiction. And if it didn't, and if it was all true, then it was an essay. And I'm not sure I have anything more profound to say about it than that. Just, I'm interested in stories. I want to tell stories. And sometimes I make them up, but a lot of times I don't.
And absolutely, and plus the excitement of trying to respond to the expectations a piece is generating, right? And to find their organic trajectory. Nick, how about you? Did you have thoughts on this idea of expectations or genre or these other elements?
I don't have as much experience in nonfiction. I've tried to write essays, and yeah, it's just for whatever reason I'm not as attracted to writing essays. I think part of it is, for me, I have a hard time, like, I don't mind writing about myself all that much, but I feel a little bit weird writing about, just people who've been in my life at some point. Like that always makes you a little bit discomforted, and I imagine even if I change the names, I worry someone would recognize, themselves. So.
Yeah. And Nick, in some ways that kind of connects to one of the questions that came in specifically about one of the stories in your collection, just the choice of that miniature ponies as appetizers. And in this story, and kind of what led to that is kind of in that blending, the same kind of blending of realism and absurdism and kind of fantasy, and kind of what led to some of those choices, and both in that story and in the rest of the collection.
Yeah, I think for that story, I mean, that was again that aunt job story, and I think sometimes if a premise is weird enough, in a funny way, it kind of dictates the gravity and the terms for the entire fictional universe that you've constructed. So that was a case where the premise felt so far off that the story ends up with this really bizarre version of the Hard Rock Cafe, where they serve these, they're like these tiny horses that have been genetically modified, and they're boneless, and you eat them raw. And I don't know if I can explain where an idea like that comes from. It just felt like it suited the piece. And I remember, that being a debate when I workshopped the story. There was at least one of my peers argued, well, the premise of the story, okay, I can take that, but this thing with the horses is just too weird. You have to get rid of that. But it also ended up being kind of the favorite feature from other readers. So I don't know where an idea that weird comes from. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer.
And that I know we're starting to run out of time here, but we have a little bit of time if as well, which is not explicit into the conversation. Based on kind of what you're saying, Nick, I know both of you and Gabe have been participants in workshop classes or teachers of writing. We have a lot of aspiring writers who have logged in, as well as professional writers and others. What are some of your thoughts maybe on maybe not exclusively the workshop process, but the kind of feedback and instruction that's most helpful to you, both as a teacher and as well as a student or participant in providing feedback to other writers?
Gabe, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, I don't mind going ahead. Workshop is a great thing. I know that once you are done and you've graduated, that is a kind of experience that you don't really ever get again. I mean, it will never be the case that you're sitting around a table with 15, 20 other people who have all read your story and are now going to talk about it for an extended period of time. That's never going to happen. It would be really awkward if it did happen, right? And so it is a tremendous privilege. At the same time, it can sometimes people have opinions. This shouldn't be a shock to anyone, and those opinions, I think, always kind of have to take them with a grain of salt. And again, I think it is very valuable to be stubborn as a writer and to just say, I like the miniature edible horses. I'm going to keep them because I like them. And the same professor who told me, just write about the stuff that you like. He said, just keep a little thing in your story that you love, a little thing that's just for you. And that was also a really good piece of advice for me, because at the time in graduate school, I was very focused on how do I perfect my craft, how do I make stories perfect. And for whatever reason, conversations with this professor convinced me nothing is perfect, and you just kind of have to find the joy in your own stories. But again, as far as the workshop goes, it really is this incredible experience. People don't always have good experiences in workshop, and I'm very cognizant of that. But it is this thing that's just it's totally unique. It never happens again in your life, and so I think that you should approach it with that mindset. Just say, this is a thing that I get to do. That's what I do as an instructor, as a leader of workshops. This is the thing that I get to do, and it's this weird kind of separate piece of my life that may never get repeated again. So I'll just stop there. But I love being part of workshops, and I feel like it's a huge privilege.
Yeah, I remember that feeling after graduate school, and I was just desperate to argue with anyone on the subway about like literature or whatever. They were all totally indifferent. I was like, please, someone argue with me. Nick, how about you? Thoughts about
Yeah, I mean, a workshop can be an invaluable focus group for writing. And I think as you take more and more of them, there's a kind of separate art form that develops in terms of negotiating the cognitive dissonance that sometimes shows up in a workshop. One person's telling you to take this character out, another person's telling you you need more of this character, and you kind of figure out just you can't listen to everyone. You end up prioritizing the feedback and saying, well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. But I mean, the only other thing I would add, workshop is great in and of itself. The other really valuable thing I have found is whatever program, I've done, like, I don't know how many graduate programs, however many I've done, I was pretty good at seeking people out in workshop who just seemed to be kind of like on a similar wavelength and befriending them, so that even after workshop had concluded, you have this kind of stable of friends who are all encouraging one another to produce writing, and you can send one another writing and get a really smart critique. So that's another really valuable thing. You end up making these connections that outlive the workshop itself. So, I mean, for me, that's been crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're about out of time. I just, as a last question, is there anything that either of you would like to leave us with, or any wisdom that you would like to impart, or anything that you could wanted to say to us? Nick, we could start with you. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I have no wisdom except I think, keep writing. I think that's all one can do.
Yeah, absolutely. Gabe, how about you?
Yeah, read as much as you can. Read stuff that you don't expect to like. Read stuff that everybody's reading, but read other stuff too. Read the classics. Read everything, and look for people who recommend books that you like. I mean, those are your people, because reading is absolutely essential. And I think there is a tendency outside of the institution to just kind of let that die out. You know, once you don't have reading lists, then you don't really know where to go next, and you don't know what to read next. And for me, at least, that was overwhelming. But just, you know, read everything, read it all.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gabe and Nick, again, for just a wonderful evening. And for what to read next, following that, there are links right here in the chat for ordering Nick and Gabe's books. So that would be your next step if you don't have them already. Thank you again for a wonderful event. And I'm certain there's applause out in cyberspace right now, even though we don't have it here. Well, thank you guys again. It was a wonderful event.
Thank you, John.